So let's talk then about some different ways to understand sacred spaces. And kind of spoiler alert at the very end, one of the points I'll make that is that ultimately the best way to understand a sacred space is simply to talk to the people who do hold that space as sacred. That is ultimately the best way, because each sacred space is its own unique phenomena in time and in place and in culture. Nonetheless, a variety of scholars and people have tried to find common themes in different sacred lands. And, common themes can be reductive, but they can also be helpful sometimes in helping give us guideposts to better understand something that we see across many cultures. So I'd like to talk about some of those guideposts, some of those different sort of ways of understanding sacred space, or you might say some of the different findings that we have found as we've looked at many sacred spaces. And one of those is the idea of sort of that sacred space tends to be spaces that are set apart by a society for a specific purpose, and that are thought of as sort of holy within that space, that other things are not supposed to impinge upon it, that it's sort of separated from a more profane or everyday reality. Indeed, this is implied in the very name of sacred space. Sacred, the English word, comes from Latin sacer, ultimately, and sacer means basically dedicated to the gods. It's like the thing that an offering you make to the gods of the temple, so sacer. So sacred space then could be thought of as something that a society offers to the divine. That says this is a divine space, we take it away from, or we mark it as separate from human spaces. And mark it as such in a variety of ways. In the Tanakh, or as it's often known in English as the Bible, particularly in what Christians would call the Old Testament, or what Jewish people would call the Hebrew Bible, or the Tanakh, there's the story of Moses and the burning bush in the book of Exodus. Before Moses leads the people of Israel out of Egypt and through their own sort of pilgrimage, in a sense, eventually towards the promised land. Before any of that happens, he has his sort of first visionary encounter with the Lord. And it says, the Lord saw that Moses had turned to see this burning bush. So there's this bush that appears to be like fiery. And God called to him from within the thorn bush, and he said, Moses, Moses. And he, or Moses, said, here I am. And then God says, do not draw near here. Take your shoes off your feet, because the place upon which you stand is holy soil. So in many religious traditions, the idea that you have to do something physical to mark that you're moving into this set apart space, the space that has been set apart or differentiated from all other kinds of spaces, in this case, taking off one's shoes. In some religious traditions, it's common not to wear hats in churches. That would be another example. In other religious traditions, it is common to put a head covering on, particularly when entering sacred spaces, such as yarmulkes within a synagogue. So these are all sorts of ways of physically showing that you're entering into a new space. I attended one time a Sundance ceremony, which I was really privileged to get to attend when I lived on the Navajo reservation. And Sundance is not originally sort of a Navajo ceremony that actually comes from different Plains tribes, but it was one that people were holding there for a specific purpose. But anyways, while we were there, one of the things that people emphasized, among other things, was that you weren't supposed to wear sunglasses. You weren't supposed to wear shades when you were standing under this ramada. That was sort of this sacred central place in the camp. So lots of different ways that we sort of symbolize this is a space set apart. And, I've mentioned already sort of the story of Moses, so that's actually a really good way to talk about this idea of space set apart. In the Hebrew Bible or the Old Testament, the Exodus narrative, we have many, many examples of this idea of a space that gets reserved for deity. When Moses goes to the top of Mount Horeb, I think it is, or Mount Moriah, but when he goes to the top of the mount to commune with deity, gain all these different commandments and ways of people to live the law, and then which includes the most famous of which being the 10 Commandments. That is a space where the rest of the Israelites are not supposed to go up into that space unless they are specifically invited, which at one point some of the elders are. And even when Moses comes down at one point, he's like emanating so brightly that it's like affecting other people, and he has to like veil himself. And so it's this like different kind of zone. Indeed, ultimately, in that narrative, the people of Israel, the tribes of Israel, enter into what we now think of as Israel/Palestine, depending on which part. And how one chooses to refer to it. And anyways, in the narrative, though, each tribe is given a different location, and then that whole place is sort of thought of as a covenant land before God, that as part of that, they are sort of covenanted to God to live a certain way on that land, to live in a certain kind of relationship of obedience to God, a certain sort of righteousness, holiness, good way of living. Even within that sort of set apart space and the idea of a set apart people, there is more specifically set apart places of worship. Originally, the tabernacle, which is like this huge, large tented building with different chambers that would be carried through the desert/wilderness by the tribes of Israel. And then eventually, they build an actual temple, a permanent tabernacle, if you will. With both the tabernacle and the eventual temple built in Jerusalem, the idea is that there are progressive zones of set apartness. There's particularly with the latest form of the temple, what's sometimes called the Temple of Herod, there is the space for Gentiles, where non-Jewish people can enter, and then a space for all Jewish people, and then a space specifically for Israelite men, and then a space specifically for priests, and then a space specifically for that only the high priest can enter, and only on a certain time of year, the most holy of holies, on the Day of Atonement or Yom Kippur, and sort of interface with the Lord for the sins of the people, which of course early Christians drew on that sort of symbolism in describing their understandings of Jesus. And so very much this sort of idea of progressive zones of set apartness where fewer and fewer people can enter as it becomes a more and more holy space. And so that's one way of thinking of sacred spaces, spaces that are set apart by a religion, as you have to take certain sort of precautions there. I was told when I was doing my fieldwork by one person that you're supposed to do songs, like sacred songs, prayer songs, when you go onto the San Francisco peaks. Many other Navajo people that I interviewed did not mention that, and some of the other things they said or did implied otherwise for them, but for at least some people, their opinion was that you should be doing song when you go to that space to be safe. Indeed, at one point there was a person who was endangered by some lightning, and somebody sort of commented that they didn't approach the space in the right way, that they didn't do a sort of song and prayer. So again, the idea of space is set apart, and in that example, as well as sort of in the idea of hold on just a minute. The idea of Moses on the mountain, sometimes sacred spaces can almost be dangerous for people because they are so powerful and full of deity that they can be perhaps dangerous in some way if people don't properly respect them. So if not danger, at least sort of an intense power. Another way of thinking of sacred space is that sacred space defines locations. We can geographers have talked a lot about this idea, sort of sacred, as well as early historians of religion like Mircea Eliade. The idea that sacred space in some way makes a territory. In my example that I already shared, many of the Navajo people I interviewed thought of the mountains as sort of within that we are protected because that's the land that was given to us by the holy people. And so that's symbolized here with this rainbow. This is the Navajo Nation flag, the 4 sacred mountains, the Navajo reservation, and then a rainbow over it all, kind of showing this idea of protectedness and blessedness within this land. So some people would even describe the mountains as pillars that hold up a sky, similar to like pillars of a hogan, although other people, I know at least one other person who was like, no, that's totally not the case. But this idea then is kind of demarcating space. We could take that kind of a step further and say, well, sorry, rewind. There's other examples as well. I mentioned already Aboriginal Australian sacred spaces. Those are often associated with specific clans, right? So they're demarcating the territory of that clan. Within Tlingit society traditionally, well, I shouldn't say traditionally, in many ways these ideas persist, but this idea of ato, or kind of like ownership, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing it correctly, and if anyone speaks Tlingit and I'm mispronouncing it, I apologize, the sort of sacred ownership that often goes along with a clan of a specific fishing location, for example, or a location in general. So again, this idea of sacred space kind of defining territories, or perhaps defining the world as a whole. Mircea Eliade was big, who was a famous early historian of religion back in the mid-20th century, a somewhat controversial one, because some argue that he had fascist politics in his early days, but he was a very famous historian of religion that ended up at University of Chicago, and he was fond of this idea and very much popularized this idea for several generations of scholars, this idea of axis mundi, and the way which is like sort of like the axis on which the world hangs, right? So this idea that sacred sites are often thought of as the center of the world. He had this idea of sort of that sacred spaces are often thought of by cultures as connecting the heavens, the earth, and the underworld. You could think of examples of these sorts of ideas. One of them is the world tree, or the Yggdrasil, within Norse traditional spirituality, and this idea of sort of a tree that unites many different realms. Back to the example of Jerusalem, there's a quote from the Midrash, which is rabbinic writings. The sages of Israel proclaimed the land of Israel is the center of the world. Jerusalem is the center of the land of Israel. So this idea of sacred spaces is the center of something, and perhaps also something that bridges multiple zones. And then people will also bring up that sacred spaces are often mountains, and kind of that plays into that idea of sort of connecting the above with the earth, the plane with perhaps the lower as well. And then you also get this idea a lot of times of sacred caves, so that just furthers that idea, right? If you've got sacred mountains reaching up, sacred caves going down. I'll be honest, I find Axis Mundi to not be the most useful way to think about sacred places. Sometimes it works, but there's a lot of times where it does not work, where sacred places are not thought of that way. That to me, it's not a terribly helpful paradigm. It's a paradigm that causes us to kind of force the data like a square peg into a round hole. I don't really like doing that. And so it does work sometimes. It's a useful idea to have in your brain because it does come into play sometimes, but there's enough times that it doesn't come into play that, in my opinion, it's not a great way to think about sacred sites as a whole, which is kind of what Eliade arguably was doing. But in any case, whether or not we accept the Axis Mundi concept, the overall idea that oftentimes people think about sacred spaces as setting as kind of a way that they map the world, totally, 100%. That comes up a lot. That comes up a lot in my other fieldwork with Latter-day Saint sacred places in New York State. People will oftentimes Latter-day Saints will oftentimes say Palmyra, and other Latter-day Saints will understand exactly, oh yeah, the place where there's these specific historic / sacred sites. And yet, if you look at Palmyra on a map, it's a tiny little town, and most people would not think of that as sort of a landmark town. I mean, it's larger than some of the towns around it, but it becomes a landmark town in New York, right? I could tell people, oh, you know, my relatives live here, which is this close to Palmyra, and people in that religious tradition would understand and have a geographic point in their mind, right? So that's kind of the point here, is that people oftentimes use sacred spaces as points on a map by which they sort of lay out a broader map of the world. A third way of thinking of sacred spaces is that they contribute to group identity. We can think of them as a central part of how groups think of themselves. The demonstrations opposing the 3 Mile Telescope at Mauna Kea, which is a mountain in Hawaii, the state of Hawaii, is a great example. It is certainly a mountain with religious significances. It is also, as you look at the movement, it is clear that there is a lot going on here, including people expressing in my opinion, Hawaiian sovereignty, indigenous Hawaiian sovereignty, and indigenous Hawaiian self-determination, or the right to kind of say what becomes of their ancestral lands. And so, yes, religiosity and also identity and culture, right? There are layers to this, and sovereignty. So sacred spaces often figure prominently into people's identity. So much so that sometimes people may experience pretty profound religious change, either departing from religion or changing to a very different religion, and yet the sacred space continues to be a prominent part of their identity, as was the case, for example, with some people I knew in my time with Navajo, where they were Christian rather than traditionalist Navajo, and yet still saw the San Francisco Peaks as kind of very, very critical for Navajo identity, and very, very disrespectful if somebody were to disrespect that. Mauna Kea similarly figures prominently, I would argue, in recent discussions as kind of not only a religious site, but a site of political self-determination, of sort of who has rights over these lands. Oak Flat is another really good example. Oak Flat is a site in Arizona that has been proposed for a copper mine, which has been opposed by certain Apache groups, including Apache Stronghold is a movement related to that. Oak Flat and the Save Oak Flat movement has opposed this copper mine, the Rio Tinto copper mine that would be placed there. I'm not sure if it has been placed there at this point. It's been several years since I was living in that part of the country. I think it's, if not constructed at this point, it's getting closer to it. But there was a strong pushback. And as you listen to people tell the stories of Oak Flat, people would talk about its connection, for example, to girls' coming of age ceremonies, that, as well as also a part of history where there was Apache people who were cornered by the US government during battles between the US government and Apache forces, and Apache people that chose to leap off a cliff rather than surrender to US forces, surrender to colonization. And so it becomes sacred in many different ways, but one layer of meaning is sort of as a site of resistance, arguably, as a site of cultural identity, as a site of we resisted colonization. Number 4, we can think of sacred spaces as living beings. So in some traditions, certainly not in all, but in some traditions, calling it a sacred land or a sacred site is perhaps itself a bit of a misnomer, as the people themselves may view these places, these mountains, as beings, or these rivers as beings. I mentioned before Mother Ganges within Hinduism. I'll mention here one that we've talked about before a couple lectures ago, but deserves mention again, which is Azangate. Azangate is a sacred mountain. It's connected with the pilgrimage to a site in the mountains of Peru, the Qualuriti festival at Mount Sinakara/Azanguate. It's associated with a visitation of Christ to an indigenous person in that space. And then it's also, before that, was associated arguably with Pariakaka, the god of rain, but now it's associated with Christ, and there's a pilgrimage, a large colorful festival with dances and traditional cultural regalia that's done annually, where people take pilgrimage to this site and hold a very, very large festival. And as I mentioned before, mining is opposed in this space by many local people, and Marisol de la Cadena wrote a really great paper about this, and she has a great quote in it. Dr. De La Cadena quotes her friend Nazaria, who said that Azanguate would not allow the mine in Sinacara, a mountain over which it presided. So the idea here is not of a mountain as a bunch of rock, so to speak. I know I'm being simplistic here, but a bunch of rock that happens because of tectonic plate collision or uplift. The idea here is of a being, right? Beings don't allow things. Beings have agency. People have agency. It says Azanguate would get mad, could even kill people. To prevent that killing the mine should not happen. So we have now kind of this idea of space set apart, but not just space set apart to a deity, or that a deity visits, but that the space itself may be a deity or a sentient being of some sort, and that therefore it has rights of self-existence that need to be taken into account. And indeed, there's been a movement of late over the last decade to gain legal rights of corporate personhood for certain sacred rivers in certain parts of the world, such as Ecuador and New Zealand. So, interesting discussions about, would there be a way within Western law to carve out a space to kind of sort of acknowledge the personhood of spaces? It's an interesting ongoing discussion. Number 5, we could think of sacred space as zones of, as I put it here, charged discourses and conflicts. So for a lot of years, Mircea Eliade's idea of sort of axis mundi, and then the bigger idea of sort of sacred space as space set apart, was kind of the dominant narrative for a lot of the people that write and talk about religion, at least in academia. In the 90s, there was a movement, 80s and 90s, spearheaded by a number of different people. You don't need to remember this, but among other things, with the book American Sacred Space, which was a famous book among academics by David Chittister and Edward T. Linenthal, as well as a bunch of different collaborators. But anyways, they and a lot of other people in the 80s and 90s started bringing up that sacred spaces, if we talk about them as spaces set apart, or as an axis mundi, it sort of implies that there's this one culture with this one kind of idea or practice of how this place gets respected. But instead, in actual reality, many sacred places are instead areas where groups have very strong feelings about and are debating and sometimes fighting, but more often just debating with words, how that space should be managed. They're sort of sites of power conflicts. One's mind immediately goes to Jerusalem, no doubt, but one could think of countless others, less extreme examples where violence is not involved, but where there's nonetheless some sort of conflict. A famous example from that book is the Pearl Harbor Memorial in Hawaii, which has been changed over the years as far as what parts of the story are emphasized. And at one point you had a number of Japanese veterans of World War II who visited the site, and there was a ceremony involving that, and sort of a healing ceremony with some American veterans as well. But there was some controversy with that, as well as controversy with the Park Service putting in signs that talked about that side of the history as well, of the Japanese military, and people feeling sort of that this is purely American space and therefore not for sort of Japanese visitors from Japan, including Japanese veterans. So there was kind of controversy involving it, right? So different conflict, or what does this site mean? Shifting meanings. Is this a site about how we were attacked? Is this a site about healing? What is this a site about? So the sacred sites are often places of contested meaning. And that's a model of sacred space that gained a lot of purchase, gained a lot of attention, and continues to be one that a lot of people use in trying to understand sacred spaces. And I think it can be a helpful one. I mean, in and of itself, it's not complete, right? It can't just be that there's conflicts, because there's all sorts of lands that people have conflicts over. But certainly the idea that when there are intense conflicts over a space's meanings, a religious space's meaning, that's an important way to think through what it is, I agree. So when you think about sacred spaces as a land steward or as somebody trying to meaningfully take care of your world, you need to think of the fact that perhaps that site does not mean the same thing to all different people, and that's an important part of the equation as well. There's a old paper that I forced my Western religions class to read, or my Abrahamic religions class to read. That's Glenn Bowman's Nationalizing the Sacred. It's from like 1993 or 1989 or something. But it is about sites associated with, I believe, Elijah the prophet from the Hebrew Bible or the Old Testament. And with this site, large chains that people go to for blessings, and sort of your average everyday people often go there for blessings, but like different religions in that space have different meanings that they ascribe to that space. And it's sort of an interesting reflection on the broader sort of identity politics at play, as well as the actual politics and the sometimes violent politics at play in Israel/Palestine, or in this case in occupied parts of Palestine, where you have different sorts of layers, and you have people sometimes more strongly identifying with their local villagers who may have a different religion than they do with religious leaders from out of town who have these very sort of Puritan ideas of what that space means. So anyways, an interesting study to look at if you ever want to. But all of this kind of reminds us of a great quote in De La Cadena's paper. The political world is a pluriverse, not a universe, right? There's many different ways to view these sites, and that can sometimes cause conflict. I like to think that it can also sometimes cause collaboration, and interesting examples of unity. We certainly have many examples of that as well, where you have people that come to a sacred site from diverse religious tradition. Kumbh Mela is a great example, where you don't just have Hindu pilgrims, but you can have sites that are sites of pilgrimage for many different religions. And so it can sometimes be a place of unity, but it can also sometimes be a place of conflict, or at the very least of different understandings of the space. And that's an important dimension as well. A sixth way of understanding sacred spaces might be to think of sacred spaces as sites of experience, as from an experiential point of view. Try to focus on what it is that people, not what it is so much, the ontological, like, oh, it's a space set apart, but instead try to think of it as like, what are people experiencing? Instead of focusing so much on, oh, it's a axis mundi that connects this, and this, or something like that. Another way to approach it might be to say, what do the people themselves say they experience when they go there? What did Moses say the experience was like after he took off his shoes? Sure, it's a space set apart. He took his shoes off. It's a space set apart. But then, like, once you enter the zone, like, what is it? Like, what is the experience for people on an emotional or an intellectual level? That's kind of the type of approach that I try to take with my research, although I also worked in this other one that we just talked about, kind of conflicting discourses. But this is one kind of way that I've thought of things when I did my own research in Western New York with the Latter-day Saint sacred site, the Sacred Grove. I'll talk more about this next week, so I'm not going to belabor the point, but people used a lot of kind of experience kind of language in describing the place. They didn't do a lot of sort of speculating of sort of how to rank it to other sacred spaces unless I asked them. Well, let me rephrase that. People, they had a lot to say about a lot of different things, but one of the things that they had the most to say was just about what it emotionally felt like. So people would talk about, oh, well, when I was a missionary in that area, we would do our scripture study there, or we'd pray there. And it's not necessary to be there, but they just felt so close to God there, because it's perceived as a place where God visited an early prophet in the Latter-day Saint faith, along with Jesus Christ. So another one was somebody who's saying, they felt like they could have a conversation there with God, like they might have in a temple. And so people would talk about these vivid emotional feelings. People would talk about just like intense peace. It's so peaceful there. Like the word peace just shows up in my survey and in interviews over and over and over and over again. And I think people meant that very sincerely. So that's one way of thinking of sacred sites. And, it's not just this one. We could think of many other examples. People talked about with the Hajj that we talked about earlier, right? What Dr. Hussein was talking about his experiences going to Mecca, right? These are, I think if we think of sacred space in that way, we can learn a lot about why people want sacred spaces to be protected by thinking of like what it means to them on sort of an emotional level. And then finally, the thing that I already spoiler alerted, but we can think of sacred spaces as what people say they are, right? That sacred spaces, ultimately, all of those different ways of understanding sacred spaces, or all of those different insights about sacred spaces, can be useful. They can teach us some things. And we don't want to always go back to the drawing board, right? We can use some of these different insights to understand when somebody says, oh, this is a sacred space. We can think, okay, it has some emotional meaning. Okay, it's a space set apart. What do we, in what ways is it set apart, right? These are guideposts. They can help us. But ultimately, the fullest meaning of a sacred space is what it means to the people involved, because on some level, sacred spaces don't fit easily into boxes. They can fit partially into boxes, but the boxes will never be perfect boxes. There will always be overflow. So talk to the people to understand what the overflow is. What does this specific place mean? When I was doing my research, there was a lot of newspaper articles coming out about that mountain, and some of them pretty solid, but some of them really reductionist, really simplistic in trying to describe what that space was to people. Because I think it's easy sometimes to be like, oh yeah, sure, a sacred space, kind of like a church, right? Okay, cool, we got it. It can be easy to kind of write something off very simplistically, but instead it takes courage and value, I think, when you're a land steward, to not just rush ahead on a project, or not just rush ahead in writing up a report about what a site means to a group that you want to be collaborating with, but instead to really say, what does it mean to folks there, and to really do the work to interview and spend time with folks and say, help me understand. So that's my spiel. That's my soapbox, and I'm sticking to it. Bye-bye.